billionaire's deaf mother nearly died in her own mansion because no one understood her signs, until a 5-year-old maid's daughter stepped out from the shadows and signed, "Don't be scared, I'm here." That tiny child, invisible to everyone, ended up exposing everything this family tried to hide. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Let's get started. I still remember the exact sound the mansion made that afternoon, the quiet hum of money. Everything in the Blackwell estate felt polished, perfectly timed, perfectly controlled. But nothing about that day stayed perfect for long. It began with a single plate sliding off the kitchen counter and shattering on the marble floor. The staff froze, startled, and then rushed to clean it up. In all the noise, no one noticed the elderly woman in the corner of the dining hall silently gasping for air. Grace Blackwell, the billionaire's deaf mother, was sitting alone at the long table, her hands shaking as she tapped desperately against her throat. Her lips were turning pale. She tried to wave at the nearest maid, but the young woman only smiled politely, thinking she was being greeted. Someone laughed. Someone else asked if she wanted tea. No one understood the frantic signs she was making, and every second she was running out of breath. I was standing near the doorway, half hidden behind my mother's legs. At 5 years old, I had learned how to make myself small. I didn't speak much. I didn't look people in the eye. I stayed where adults wouldn't trip over me. My mother told me that being invisible was safer, and for most of my life it was. But something about the way the old woman's fingers twisted in the air, sharp, urgent, terrified, cut straight through me. I recognized it. The shape of pain. The shape of fear. The same shapes I once used when I couldn't talk at all. Before I knew it, my feet were already moving. I stepped out from behind the doorway and crossed the silent, echoing space between us. No one noticed me until I tugged gently at her trembling sleeve. She turned to me with eyes wide and pleading. I raised my hands. "Are you hurting?" I signed slowly the way my mother had taught me. "Can't breathe." Her reaction was immediate relief washed over her face like light breaking through storm clouds. Tears filled her eyes as she tried to sign back, shaky but clear enough for me to understand. The staff looked over, confused by the sudden stillness. No one expected a tiny girl in a faded dress to be the first person who understood what was happening. I pressed my hand to her back, steadying her. "I'll help," I signed again. "Don't be scared." That moment, those few seconds of silence spread across the room like a wave. The head housekeeper finally noticed Grace's struggle and screamed for help. Chairs scraped. Someone ran. Someone yelled for water before realizing that wasn't what she needed. And then a tall figure appeared in the doorway, stopping dead in his tracks as if he'd walked into a dream he didn't understand. Jason Blackwell, her son, the billionaire everyone else whispered about, stood frozen as he saw his mother clutching her chest, and a small maid's daughter with trembling fingers signing gently to her. For a second, he didn't breathe. None of us did. Because for the first time in years, Grace's lips curved into a faint, grateful smile. Jason stepped forward slowly, eyes fixed on me like I was a puzzle that didn't belong in his world. Later, he would tell me he'd always thought of me as the quiet little girl who hid behind her mother's apron, someone who barely existed in the edges of his vision. But not now. Not when he saw his mother reaching for my hands like I was the only person who could understand her. Why does she know sign language?" he asked, his voice barely steady. My mother swallowed hard. She stood behind me, shoulders tense, as if afraid of what the truth might reveal. She didn't answer right away. She couldn't. Because the truth wasn't just about how I learned to sign. It was about the past she had spent years running from one name she never wanted spoken again. But Jason wasn't going to let this moment slip away. Not when his mother was clutching my sleeve like I was her lifeline, and not when the entire mansion had just witnessed something impossible. A billionaire's deaf mother nearly died in her own home, and the only person who understood her cry for help was a 5-year-old girl no one ever paid attention to. That was the moment everything began to change. The mansion didn't quiet down after the incident. It buzzed with a different kind of noise, the kind that follows a miracle no one knows how to explain. I heard the whispers long before I saw the faces behind them. "How did she know sign language?" one maid murmured while wiping the counter. "She's only 5. Another added, "Mrs. Grace is asking for her. She won't stop signing, 'Where's the girl?'" For the first time since we'd arrived at the Blackwell estate, people were looking for me. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because I had understood the hands of a woman everyone else had missed. Jason watched from the balcony as staff drifted through hallways, checking rooms and calling my name softly. He leaned against the railing with a look that didn't match his usual cool detachment. He wanted to know who I was, really was. A child living under his roof, yet somehow invisible to him until yesterday. He found me in the kitchen, curled beside the pantry door with my knees pulled to my chest. That was where I hid most days. My mother always said the quieter I was, the safer I'd be. And so I learned how to disappear, slipping behind curtains, shrinking under tables, moving like a shadow that no one bothered to follow. I rarely spoke, and when strangers looked my way, I clutched my ragged doll and lowered my head until their attention passed over me like wind. But Jason didn't walk past me. He knelt slowly, watching the way I avoided his gaze, the way my shoulders tightened at every footstep behind him. He didn't know it yet, but he was piecing together a puzzle I'd spent years trying to bury. He turned to my mother. "Why does she know sign language so well?" he asked. My mother stiffened. "She learned it because she needed it," she whispered. But that wasn't the full truth, and she knew it. Years ago, I had stopped talking altogether. 12 long months of silence, not a word escaping my lips. Only my hands moved, grasping for something, anything that could help me communicate with the world I no longer trusted. My mother taught me the simplest signs: hurt, scared, breathe, help. She didn't say why I had become so afraid. She never said the name that hovered over both of us like a shadow. And Jason felt that silence. He wasn't a man who missed details. The next morning, Mrs. Grace called for me again. I followed her to the garden where she sat in the warm sun and motioned for me to sit beside her. Her hands moved slowly, at first testing if I understood. I answered with small, careful signs. She smiled, a soft, full smile that transformed her whole face. It was the first time I'd ever seen joy flicker across her features. We talked like that for a long time, hands dancing through the air. A woman who had been lonely for years, and a child who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Jason was watching from the patio door, stunned by the way I laughed, quiet and breathy, but real. It was the first time I had ever laughed in front of someone who wasn't my mother. But moments like that don't stay untouched for long. When we went back inside, I tugged at my mother's sleeve and signed without thinking, "I'm scared. I don't want Adrian to find us." Jason had been passing through the hallway at that exact moment. He froze. His eyes sharpened, recognition, confusion, suspicion, all battling for space. He knew the name. Adrian Gates wasn't just any man. He was a current partner in a major business deal Jason was preparing to finalize. My mother's face drained of color. She pulled me behind her like a shield and muttered, "She's just a child. She doesn't know what she's saying." But Jason wasn't convinced. His gaze drifted to my trembling hands, to the way I flinched when a male employee walked by, to the faint blue shadows beneath my eyes. Something wasn't right. Something had happened. Something my mother was terrified would surface. Later that night, Jason passed by the kitchen and heard quiet sobbing. My mother thought she was alone as she pressed her forehead against the counter, whispering apologies into her hands. She believed the past had died the day she fled. She believed the danger was gone. But she didn't know children remember more than adults want them to. In the dim light, I sat with Mrs. Grace and signed the memory I couldn't forget. Adrian made Mama cry. Took her money, said he'd take me. Mrs. Grace's face twisted in horror. She grabbed Jason's wrist and signed fiercely, every gesture a command: "The child isn't lying. Investigate." By the time midnight settled over the mansion, Jason was alone in his office, backlit by the cold glow of his computer screen. Files, bank statements, and transaction histories were spread across his desk. Line after line of Adrian's reports didn't add up. Too many gaps, too many red flags, too many coincidences matching the timeline of my mother's disappearance. Jason leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed to his forehead. Maybe, he whispered into the empty room, that little girl just uncovered the dirtiest secret my partner's been hiding. And from that moment forward, he knew nothing in his world was as it seemed. The next morning should have been ordinary sunlight over the garden, quiet footsteps of staff preparing breakfast, the usual stillness of a house built on money and routine. But nothing about the air felt normal when Elena stepped outside to play with Grace in the small garden behind the mansion. Every time a car rolled up the driveway, even if it was just a delivery van or a groundskeeper's truck, her tiny fingers dug into Grace's sleeve. Her whole body tensed, eyes darting toward the sound as if expecting a monster to appear. Grace touched her shoulder gently and signed, "Are you scared?" Elena nodded, barely lifting her chin. The fear in her eyes didn't look like the shyness of a child. It looked like memory. Up on the second-floor balcony, Jason stood unnoticed, one hand resting on the railing as he watched the scene unfold below him. He had seen anxious children before. He had helped families through crises while funding pediatric programs. But nothing prepared him for the way Elena flinched when a male landscaper walked past the garden gate. She shrank behind Grace instantly, her small hands trembling. Jason remembered her signing just one day earlier, "I don't want Adrian to find us." The name echoed like a warning inside his head. He waited until Elena returned inside before asking Maria to join him in his office. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calmness alone sharpened the tension in the room. "Adrian Gates," he said. "Your daughter is terrified of him." Why, Maria's breath hitched. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She's only a child. She imagines things. She misunderstands a lot. But at that exact moment, Elena peeked around the half-open door, her face pale as she spotted her mother with Jason. Her eyes widened, not in curiosity, but in fear. She stepped back quickly, clutching her doll so tightly its stuffing showed through the seams. Jason didn't miss any of it. Later that afternoon, Grace asked the head housekeeper for the old employee albums stored in the attic. She shuffled through them with surprisingly steady fingers until she found Maria's profile, years-old photographs of her smiling hair, braided neatly, eyes bright. Then suddenly, after a certain year, she disappeared from the record entirely. No explanations, no logs, no updates, just gone. Jason compared the dates with the timeline in his head, the exact period when Elena stopped talking. Every red flag he'd ignored before now snapped into focus. Grace sat with Elena again in the living room and signed softly. "Did you meet Adrian?" before Elena hesitated, then nodded, eyes down. "Bad man," she signed. "Made Mama cry." Jason felt a cold spike crawl up his spine. These signs were too deliberate, too precise, too tied to real trauma for a 5-year-old to invent. Something shifted inside him then. This wasn't an issue involving just his employee anymore. His mother had been endangered. A child living in his home was carrying scars no one had addressed. And Adrian, the man he planned to trust with millions, was somewhere entangled in both. Jason stayed up that night combing through every financial document Adrian had ever handed him. And for the first time, the inconsistencies stood out like flashing lights. Transfers to untraceable accounts. A declared bankruptcy followed by a suspiciously fast investment rebound. Money funneled through shell charities that didn't exist. It was the pattern of a man siphoning from someone too powerless to fight back. Jason pushed back from his desk and reached for his phone. His voice was steady when the legal department answered. "Prepare every file you have on Adrian Gates," he said. "I want to know where every dollar in his accounts came from." He ended the call staring out the window toward the dark garden where Elena had played earlier. The silence around him wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that warned something terrible was coming. And he was done pretending he didn't hear it. Jason didn't sleep that night. When the mansion was finally quiet and all the lights had gone out except the faint glow of hallway sconces, he was still sitting at his desk, lit only by the cold blue glare of his computer screen. Financial documents filled the display, each one more troubling than the last. Numbers that didn't add up. Transactions routed through offshore accounts. Sudden spikes of capital that came from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Everything pointed back to one name: Adrian Gates. And now, Maria, Elena, the missing years, the fear. The connections were too sharp to ignore. By sunrise, Jason walked into the kitchen with dark circles under his eyes and an anger he hadn't fully allowed himself to feel yet. He found Maria wiping the counter, pretending not to notice him. "Tell me what he did," he said quietly. "I know Adrian is tied to you and Elena. I know it's not nothing." Maria's shoulders began to shake. She didn't even try to hide it. She slid into a chair as if her legs could no longer carry her and pressed both hands over her face. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't tell Elena. She's been through enough." "Then tell me," Jason said. Not harsh, not cold. Just firm, anchored in a promise he hadn't spoken yet, but already meant. Maria finally looked up, eyes red. She spoke slowly, voice barely holding together. She told him about working at a small cafe, about a charming customer who came every day, who smiled and tipped generously, who earned her trust before slipping paperwork across the counter and calling it an opportunity. She signed documents she didn't understand. And when the debts mounted, he showed her who he really was. He said if I couldn't pay, she whispered, he'd take my daughter. Teach her to be obedient. Teach her what real discipline meant. Jason felt something inside him burn hot, then cold. She told him how she packed everything she owned into a single bag, fled the city with Elena in her arms, and found work wherever she could. She told him how she prayed Adrian would never find them again. By the time she finished, Jason's jaw was set so tightly he could barely speak. This wasn't just fraud, he said. This was extortion and attempted kidnapping. He finally understood why Elena shook at the sound of tires on gravel, why she hid behind anyone she trusted, why she had gone silent for almost a year. Grace entered the room, then a shawl around her shoulders. She had sensed the emotional heaviness the moment she stepped in. She placed a gentle hand on Jason's arm and signed with sharp, urgent movements the child remembers. Children don't invent things like this. Jason swallowed hard. Grace signed again. You must protect them. He nodded a promise, solidifying inside him. He turned back to Maria. You're not alone anymore, he said. I will make sure he never touches either of you again. For the first time since she arrived at the mansion, Maria broke down, not from fear but relief. Jason rose, pacing once before stopping in front of the window that looked over the backyard. He could see Elena picking flowers near the fountain, unaware of the storm building around her. He knew what he had to do. He spent the next hours contacting lawyers, pulling financial records, cross-checking every transfer Adrian had ever made. The evidence built itself: forged signatures, illegal withdrawals, misdirection of funds, threats documented in voicemail metadata. It was enough to destroy a career and send a man to prison. But Jason didn't want to wait for the courts. He wanted Adrian to face what he had done. That afternoon, after reviewing the final set of files, he called his assistant. His voice was smooth but carried an edge that left no room for argument. Invite Adrian Gates to the mansion, he said. Tell him it's urgent. Should I schedule the meeting off-site, she asked. No, Jason replied. Here, in my home. He looked out the window again, watching as Elena twirled in the sunlight, her small hands signing something to Grace that made the older woman laugh. I'll make him answer for everything, he murmured, right here. And for the first time in days, Jason felt the clarity of a man who finally understood his purpose. He wasn't just uncovering a financial crime. He was preparing to protect a child. Jason woke up the next morning to a sound he hadn't heard inside the Blackwell mansion in years. A gentle burst of laughter drifting up the staircase. It wasn't loud, not chaotic or sharp. It was warm, breathy, hesitant, the kind of laugh that felt like sunlight slipping through blinds. He sat up, unsure if he had imagined it, until another soft note floated up from downstairs. Someone was laughing with his mother. He went down the steps, slowly stopping at the landing above the living room. And there they were. Grace settled into her favorite armchair, her hands moving in smooth, expressive shapes, and Elena sitting cross-legged on the rug in front of her, signing back with tiny, purposeful motions. Grace's face glowed with delight, her eyes creasing at the corners the way they used to when his father was still alive. Jason gripped the railing, afraid that if he blinked, the fragile moment would disappear. Grace signed, "What are you telling me?" Elena's fingers moved clumsily but full of excitement. "I saw a cat yesterday. Big cat. Very big." Her gestures were uneven and slightly exaggerated, but the meaning was unmistakable. Jason watched, stunned. There was clarity in the way she communicated, confidence even. He had seen trained interpreters sign less cleanly than this 5-year-old girl with tangled hair and a faded dress. It made him wonder how many secrets had been trapped in that small body. And for how long Maria entered the room at that moment with a tray of tea, but the instant she saw Elena signing happily, her smile faltered. Her entire posture stiffened. She stepped forward quickly and reached for Elena's arm. "Sweetheart, don't bother Mrs. Grace," she whispered. But Grace immediately lifted her hands in firm protest. "Not a bother," she signed sharply. "I like her. She is smart." Jason caught the tremor in Maria's hands as she pulled the tray closer to her chest. Fear flickered across her eyes, raw, instinctive fear. It wasn't the reaction of a mother embarrassed by her child. It was the reaction of someone who had learned never to draw attention, someone who believed that joy was dangerous. From that day forward, nothing in the mansion remained the same. Elena no longer clung to the back of her mother's skirt. She wandered the halls cautiously, at first testing the boundaries of visibility. She peeked into the kitchen where the staff smiled awkwardly while trying to mimic simple signs. Over the next week, the cook learned hungry, the maid learned thank you, and the gardener learned good morning. No one announced that the household was changing, but every day it shifted a little more toward the quiet language of one small girl. Still, cracks appeared through the calm. One afternoon, a tall male staff member entered the foyer carrying boxes from the garage. Elena saw him from across the room and froze. Her eyes widened. Her hands shook. Then she dove behind the couch so fast that her doll fell from her grip and rolled across the tiles. Grace hurried over, kneeling beside her and stroking her hair. Elena signed rapidly, "I'm scared, scared, scared." Grace pulled her close and signed slowly, "You're safe. I'm here." Jason watched from the doorway, and the truth struck him harder than before. This wasn't shyness. It wasn't a phase. It was trauma. Later that evening, he found Maria in the kitchen, standing over the sink with her head bowed. Her shoulders were trembling. Jason stepped closer, but she didn't notice until he spoke. "I saw Elena earlier," he said quietly. "She was terrified. Why? What happened to her?" Maria pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to hold back a sob. When she finally managed to speak, her voice cracked. "If she keeps being scared like this," she whispered, "she'll never grow up normal. She'll never be free." Jason felt something heavy settle in his chest. A protective instinct stronger than anything he'd ever felt towards someone outside his family. "What happened to her?" he repeated. "What did she see? Who did this to her?" Maria didn't answer. But her silence, her trembling, was the answer. Jason stepped back, running a hand through his hair, forcing his voice to steady. "I will protect both of you," he said. "But I need to know who we're up against." Maria's eyes met his wide and terrified, not of him, but of the truth. Jason took one breath, then another, as the realization unfurled inside him like a blade. A child didn't become this afraid without a reason, and he was done pretending the reason wasn't closing in on them. Jason didn't mean to overhear it. He had only gone to the kitchen for a glass of water before a meeting, but when he reached the doorway, he froze. Elena stood beside Maria near the counter, her small hands moving quickly, too quickly, the motions sharp with panic. "I don't want Adrian to find me," she signed. Jason felt his heart stop. The name hit him like a physical blow, sharp and cold, sliding straight into his spine. Adrian. The same Adrian he'd partnered with. The same Adrian he trusted with millions. He stepped into the kitchen slowly. Adrian, who he asked, his voice low and controlled. Elena jumped and darted behind the cupboard, trembling. Maria grabbed her, shielding her with her body. Jason took another step. What did he do? His voice was no longer businesslike. It was the voice of a man who would tear apart the world to protect the people standing in front of him. Maria tried to speak, but her lips trembled. Finally, she whispered, "He helped us. Financially. A long time ago." Jason's jaw clenched. He waited. Maria swallowed hard. "He wasn't helping," she admitted. "He tricked me into signing loan papers. He said it was for investment. When I couldn't pay..." Her voice broke. "He threatened to take Elena. Said he would. Teach her discipline." Jason's stomach twisted. "He threatened to take your daughter." He repeated, his voice shaking with anger he struggled to contain. "Did he ever touch her?" "No," Maria said quickly. "But he didn't have to. His words alone were enough. Enough to make us run." Jason stepped back, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly his knuckles whitened. He wanted to tear something apart. He wanted to find Adrian right then and break every bone in his body for even thinking about hurting a child. Grace entered quietly, sensing the tension. She looked between them, her eyes narrowing. She touched Jason's arm and signed with sharp, decisive gestures. "Elena isn't lying. Children don't invent monsters." Jason stared at the small figure hiding behind Maria, the terror in Elena's eyes, the flinching at footsteps, the silence. Every piece fit. He swallowed tightly. He could taste fury rising in his throat. He went to his office and pulled out the financial files again. Now that he knew what to look for, the truth glared back at him. The fraudulent investments, the suspicious transfers. The bankruptcy claim filed the same year Maria disappeared. Adrian hadn't rebuilt his wealth through luck. He had rebuilt it through theft, through Maria's stolen savings. And Jason's company had unknowingly benefited. His stomach churned with disgust. Grace entered the office again, signing softly, "You must protect them." Jason nodded. He didn't need convincing anymore. He needed action. He called the head housekeeper. "The one-way glass in the main guest room, is it still installed?" She nodded, confused. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell. Why do you ask?" "Prepare the room," he said. "I want a meeting with Adrian Gates. Here. Today." She hesitated. "Should I tell him why?" Jason's voice hardened. "Just tell him it's urgent." He typed a message to Adrian. "We need to talk. Come to the mansion. Now." Later that night, as he walked down the hall, he felt a small tug on his sleeve. Elena looked up at him with wide eyes, signing, "Is the bad man coming?" Jason knelt, so they were eye level. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "Yes," he said softly. "But this time, he won't be able to hurt you." Elena nodded slowly, trusting him in a way that struck him deep. Jason watched her walk back toward her mother, and the decision solidified inside him like steel. "This isn't business anymore," he whispered to himself. "This is justice for a child." The living room of the Blackwell mansion had never felt this cold, this sharp, this surgical. Every sofa had been pushed aside, leaving the room open like an arena. The chandeliers were dimmed, so the light from the tall windows fell straight onto the center of the room, onto the glass table Jason had polished himself until it reflected every movement like a mirror. He stood alone, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, his eyes fixed on the massive one-way glass standing behind him. Behind that glass, Maria and Elena waited. The weight of everything that was about to happen pressed into his spine. Elena clung to her mother's hand, her tiny fingers squeezing so hard her knuckles turned white. Her breaths were short and shallow. She kept signing the same question again and again, "Is the bad man coming?" Her hands shook so much the signs trembled in the air. Maria tried to hold her, whispering soft reassurances, but her own fear bled through every word. That was when Grace stepped forward. She gently placed her hands on Elena's shoulders, guiding the girl to look at her. With slow, steady movements, she signed, "I'm here. Stand behind me." Grace's eyes were so firm that even Elena's trembling slowed. Then the door opened. Adrian walked in as though he owned the room. His expensive suit caught the light, but his face didn't. His expression froze the moment he saw Jason standing there, rigid, silent, waiting. "Jason," he said with forced warmth. You called me here without telling me why Jason didn't answer. He simply gestured at the chair opposite him. Adrian sat down slowly, his posture stiff, his eyes trying to read Jason's expression and failing. But when he looked toward the one-way glass just for a second, something in his face changed. A flicker of recognition. A twitch of fear. His hand tightened around the arm of the chair, betraying him long before he opened his mouth. On the other side of the glass, Elena reacted instantly. Her body folded inward as if the sight of him reached through the wall and grabbed her. She covered her face with her hands, signing wildly, "No, no, scared, scared." Maria tried to pull her close, but her own breaths were shaking. Grace moved in front of them both, shielding Elena with her body, and whispered a silent promise. "You are safe." Jason saw the way Adrian's eyes darted around the room, searching for something he couldn't name. He stepped forward and placed a folder on the glass table. "I want to review some of your investment documents," he said, voice flat. Adrian forced a laugh. "That's all you could have called. Why drag me here?" Jason opened the folder and slid a page forward. "Because these transactions match the same period when a woman named Maria Gomez lost every cent she had." Adrian blinked. The smile slipped. "I don't remember her," he said too quickly. Jason leaned in. "Then you'll remember this one, Elena Gomez." Adrian shot to his feet, the chair scraping loudly across the marble floor. His eyes darted to the mirror again, too fast, too familiar, and panic flared across his face. The kid. "She's still here," he blurted out before he could stop himself. Behind the glass, Maria choked on her breath. Elena whimpered and buried her face against Grace's chest. Jason's jaw tightened so hard it ached. He slammed the rest of the documents onto the table. "How do you know she's still alive?" he asked, voice a low growl. "Where did you expect her to be?" Adrian backed away, hands raised as if warding off an invisible blow. "Jason, come on. This is business. Nothing we can't settle." But Jason shoved a paper toward him. "This is a signature obtained under threat." He shoved another. "This is a fraudulent loan agreement." Another. "This is money stolen from Maria Gomez and pushed into your supposed restructuring fund." Adrian's composure cracked. Sweat beaded at his forehead, and he sank into the chair, mouth opening and closing like a man running out of lies. Jason stared at him with disgust. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small recording device, and placed it on the table. He clicked it on. "I think," he said, his voice hardening into steel, "it's time for you to hear from someone who remembers everything you did." Behind the glass, Elena looked up, eyes wide and frightened. Jason turned toward the hidden door, nodded once, and said, "Bring her in." The small side door opened with a soft click. Elena appeared first, clutching Maria's hand so tightly her tiny knuckles looked like pearls under strain. Her steps were hesitant, fragile, each one requiring courage far beyond her age. Grace followed them, standing tall, her presence radiant with quiet protection. As soon as Adrian saw Elena enter the room, he recoiled like he had been struck. "No," he whispered, stumbling backward. She isn't supposed to be here." Jason moved a small chair next to his own and knelt beside it. "Elena," he said gently, "you only need to sign. I'm right here. No one can hurt you." The girl turned her face upward, searching his eyes, and something in her expression shifted. Trust formed where fear had lived. She climbed into the chair legs, dangling back straight, but trembling. Her hands rose slowly, and the room fell absolutely silent. She signed the first sentence with small, deliberate motions. "He made my mom cry." Her arms barely moved, her fingers shaking with effort. The words were soft, but the impact hit like thunder. Adrian shot out of his chair. "She's lying," he shouted. Jason extended an arm in front of Elena without looking away from Adrian. "Sit down." Elena didn't stop. Her hands lifted again, the gestures timid but unmistakable. "He took money. Mom said no." He yelled. Maria broke into sobs, covering her mouth, shoulders shaking violently. Grace stroked her back, her eyes sharp and glistening as she watched Elena's brave, broken truth spill into the air. Then Elena signed the sentence that froze the entire mansion. He said, "If Mom didn't listen, he would take me." Jason closed his eyes, jaw clenched so tightly he tasted blood. Adrian staggered against the wall, face drained of color. She remembers he gasped, voice thin with panic. Jason grabbed another document from the folder and dropped it with a slap onto the table. "These," he said, "are the forged loan documents you forced her to sign." He dropped another. "These show the money you stole." Another. "And these show every cent funneled into my project." Adrian's knees buckled. He sank onto the couch, his breath heaving, his lies collapsing one by one. Jason turned to Elena, his voice softening again. "Elena, did this man threaten to take you away from your mother?" The girl swallowed, raised her hands, and signed a single word. "Yes." Grace stepped forward, then moving beside Jason. She placed both hands on his arm and signed with fierce clarity. Jason interpreted out loud each word like a verdict. "We believe her. Children don't invent monsters. You are dangerous." Adrian bolted toward the door, but two security guards already summoned stepped in, blocking his escape. "Let me out," he shouted. "This isn't fair." "This is Jason," pulled out his phone and dialed. "This is Jason Blackwell," he said calmly into the receiver. "I'm reporting fraud, extortion, and threats against 2 members of my household. Send officers to the mansion immediately." Adrian's protests turned into a frantic babble as he was held in place. Elena slid off her chair and ran straight into Jason's arms, signing through tears. "You're good. I'm not scared now." Jason knelt, holding her with one hand over her small back, the other shielding her from the sight of Adrian being restrained. "No one," he whispered into her hair, "will ever hurt you again." Outside, the sirens were already approaching. Inside, for the first time, the truth finally had a voice. The flashing red and blue lights swept across the marble walls of the Blackwell mansion like waves of judgment arriving at last. Elena stood beside Jason as the front doors opened to reveal 2 officers stepping inside, their shadows stretching long across the polished floor. For the first time, she didn't hide. Her small fingers curled around Jason's pant leg, but her chin lifted just enough to show she wanted to see it happen. She wanted to see the man who haunted her finally taken away. Jason knelt slightly, his hand resting gently on her back. "Today," he murmured, "you're free." Elena nodded barely, but she didn't look away from the hallway where Adrian was being escorted out of the study. His protests echoed through the foyer. "This is ridiculous. They're lying. She's lying." His voice cracked, but the officers didn't flinch. "Sir, we have financial records and multiple witnesses," one officer said calmly as he pulled Adrian's hands behind him. The metallic click of handcuffs filled the foyer. Elena flinched at the sound, but instead of turning away, she watched. Her wide eyes held no panic this time, only certainty, as if she needed to witness the moment her fear lost its power. Maria fell onto the nearest armchair, burying her face in her hands, as years of terror drained out of her in shaking sobs. Jason crossed the room and knelt beside her, keeping his voice gentle. "He'll never touch you or Elena again. Not ever." Maria tried to speak, but her breath broke. "Thank you for believing me, for believing her." Grace approached Elena slowly, lowering herself to her knees even though pain tightened every movement. Her hands rose, shaping the slow, tender signs Elena knew so well. "You were brave." She signed, her eyes warm. Elena reached forward and touched her fingers lightly before signing back, "I was scared. But you were here." Grace smiled through tears, an expression Jason hadn't seen in years. Adrian was dragged down the hallway toward the front door. Elena followed his movement from behind Jason, peeking around him like a child watching her nightmares dissolve into daylight. Adrian twisted once, trying to look back, but this time Elena didn't shrink. She simply held Jason's hand and stood still as the door closed behind the officers and the patrol car swallowed him whole. Inside the study, Jason reviewed the stack of reports his legal team had sent. More fraud, more lies, More threats than Maria ever dared admit. He clenched the papers, anger simmering low in his chest. Adrian had used Maria's stolen money to prop up his own investments. He had laundered pain into profit. Jason found Maria in the kitchen later, still shaken but breathing deeply for the first time in years. "You don't need to work here anymore," Jason said softly. "Not like before." Maria shook her head almost instantly. "No, I don't want charity." Before she could finish, Jason cut her off gently. "It's not charity. It's gratitude. Elena saved my mother, and both of you deserve safety." Elena tugged her mother's sleeve and signed timidly. "I want to stay with Grandma Grace." Maria froze, emotions clashing behind her eyes. Before she could answer, Grace stepped inside the kitchen, her signed message calm but firm. "Stay. Elena needs us. We need her too." Maria broke down again this time, collapsing into Grace's arms, the first real embrace she'd had in years. Jason watched them silently, realizing the house no longer felt like a mansion. It felt like something entirely new. Later in the quiet of the evening, Jason knelt in front of Elena. "If you're going to keep learning sign language with her," he said with a half smile, "you'll have to teach me too." Elena's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in amusement as she nodded. Grace signed Little Star from across the room. Elena tilted her head. "Why?" her hands asked. Grace touched Elena's forehead gently, answering with a simple sign, "Because you arrived when we needed light." Jason looked at the little girl who had turned his home upside down and silently thought, a new family, born from a 5-year-old's courage. 3 months later, the Blackwell mansion barely resembled the silent, rigid home it once was. The kitchen buzzed with the soft sound of hands moving through the air staff, signing to one another as they worked. One asked for coffee, another for sugar, and a third tried to sign all good but ended up signing thunder by mistake, sending Elena into giggles so bright that everyone laughed with her. The house had transformed into a warm living classroom of gestures and gentle glances. Jason came down the stairs, still adjusting his tie, and attempted a sloppy good morning sign with one hand. Elena burst into quiet laughter, covering her mouth as her shoulders shook. Jason groaned playfully. I know, I'm terrible. Help me fix it." She took his hands and guided them through each movement with the seriousness of a miniature teacher, her brows furrowed in focus. Maria entered with a tray no longer moving, like a shadow trying to disappear. She walked taller, spoke easier, even joked occasionally with the staff. The fear that once clung to her like a second skin had finally lifted. Jason noticed and felt something warm settle in his chest. In the sunlit garden, Grace sipped her morning tea while Elena sat cross-legged beside her. The two signed back and forth effortlessly, stories about Grace's youth, questions about flowers, and silly jokes Elena had learned. Grace was no longer the lonely, silent woman hidden in the corners of the house. She had bloomed again, and Elena had been the first to water that seed. News about Adrian's sentencing played quietly on the living room TV. Businessman Adrian Gates receives a multi-year sentence for fraud, extortion, and threats. Elena paused her drawing at the sound of his name. She looked up. Jason sat beside her, resting a hand on her small back. "He won't come back," he promised gently. Elena nodded and went back to her drawing, this time adding a figure standing between her and her mother. The figure looked suspiciously like Jason. That evening, Jason called Maria outside to the porch. The sunset cast gold across the stones as he turned to her. "I want you and Elena to live here as family," he said simply. Maria's eyes widened, her breath hitching. I don't know what to say." Jason smiled. "Say Jason, not sir. Elena already does." A small laugh slipped from Maria despite her tears. Elena peeked from behind the door, grinning silently. Elena walked up to Jason and signed softly. "You're good." Jason took his time responding, making sure every movement was correct. "You," he signed carefully, "are this house's light." She threw her arms around him, not out of fear but out of trust, and he held her close. Later that night, the entire staff gathered in the living room, practicing new signs to wish Grace good night. Elena stood proudly in the center, demonstrating the motions with exaggerated seriousness while everyone tried to keep up. Grace watched from her chair, eyes shining with emotion. This little girl had changed her life more than any medicine ever could. Jason stood in the doorway, taking in the scene, the hands moving in harmony, the soft laughter, the warmth that filled every corner. All of it had begun because a silent child reached out to help someone who needed saving. Grace signed to Elena across the room, hands slow and full of meaning. "You saved your mother. You saved me. You saved all of us." Elena signed back. "I just wanted to help." Jason rested a hand on her shoulder, anchoring the moment as he whispered, "You did more than that. You brought light here." And from that day forward, the Blackwell mansion was no longer defined by wealth or silence. It became a home shaped by kindness, courage, and a language that needed no sound at all. Life isn't about avoiding the storms. It's about finding the strength that rises in the middle of them. And when compassion steps forward, even the hardest chapters begin to soften. If this story kept you company, wherever you are right now, maybe at home, maybe on a late drive, drop a comment and tell me what part stayed with you. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe so we can keep sharing these stories together.